It's Friday, October the 9th, 2020. Welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor, and my name is Pam. Let's begin with our first article. In the Trump Economy, Echoes of Hoover and Carter by Laurent Belset. Even before he officially took the reins of office, Donald Trump has sought to use his presidency to rebuild hope in blue-collar America. There were the jobs at the Carrier air conditioning factory in Indianapolis that, as president-elect, he saved from going to Mexico. The huge Foxconn deal in southern Wisconsin, the eighth wonder of the world, President Trump called it, that would bring TV manufacturing back to the United States, and U.S. Steel's $1.5 billion investment in southwestern Pennsylvania that would bring state-of-the-art steel casting back to U.S. shores. They are shimmering symbols for the president's vision for a once and now great again America. Bright because of the rhetoric Mr. Trump's employees, shimmering because the results are, at best, hazy. Has he really changed the economy, and in a way that helps blue-collar workers? All presidents, of course, have limited control over the economy. Global forces and unforeseen events, such as a pandemic, can sink any president's agenda, and a fractious Congress can stymie new efforts. For several months, the economy's needs for new coronavirus relief has gone unmet, partly due to Mr. Trump's own negotiating tactics, but also because of the disconnect between a Democratic-controlled House and a Senate Republicans with a distaste for more stimulus packages. On Tuesday, Mr. Trump sent stock markets skidding after tweeting that he was ending stimulus discussions with House Democrats, then sent them soaring Wednesday with tweets suggesting a narrower stimulus could still be passed. This week's volatility could be an apt symbol of the president's course on the economy. In some ways, it may prove transformative, such as in trade relations with China. On other fronts, his efforts may not prove path-breaking, but rather a last gasp of ideas like massive tax cuts, which are now under strain. Some policy experts even say his tenure could be one of those rare end-of-an-era presidencies in which a leader has a foot in the past as well as in the future. Parts of their genius, and I wouldn't exclude Trump from this at all, is their understanding that the old established regime has lost control, says Stephen Skowronek, a Yale political scientist. Hoover, Carter, and Trump. These presidents break some norms to try to meet new and unanticipated challenges. Herbert Hoover used federal spending to try to stimulate the economy during the Depression. Jimmy Carter started deregulating industries and appointing an inflation fighter to head the Federal Reserve and fight the era's stagflation, rather than someone in the New Deal tradition committed to preserving jobs. Often, they are outsiders who tout their non-Washington credentials and unique skills to revitalize increasingly creaky coalitions. But their reforms are too timid because they're still tied to the old regime, argues Mr. Skowronek, author of a forthcoming book, Phantoms of a Beleaguered Republic, the Deep State and the Unitary Executive. Just as Hoover heralded the end of post-Civil War laissez-faire republicanism and Mr. Carter was the last of the New Deal Democrats, so Mr. Trump may well signal the end of the Reagan Revolution. These disjunctive presidents, as Mr. Skowronek calls them, tend to become failed one-term presidents who give way to transformative presidents who build a new coalition around a set of ideas often foreshadowed by the policies of their predecessors. Franklin Roosevelt boosted stimulus spending far beyond what Hoover dreamed. Ronald Reagan made deregulation a central part of his movement to get government off people's backs. In the case of President Trump, the failures are visible. The Carrier factory eventually moved some of its production to Mexico and now employs fewer workers than when the president intervened. U.S. Steel has delayed indefinitely its investment in the Mon Valley Works, and the Foxconn project, originally intended to create 13,000 manufacturing jobs, has so far created only about 800 and has been dramatically scaled back to become a technology hub with assembly and packaging operations. Hardly the eighth wonder of Wisconsin, let alone the world. Yet it would be a mistake to dismiss his economic vision, economists and historians say. The Trump rhetoric hits home with workers that have been passed by the new economy. For decades, administrations on both sides of the political spectrum left factory workers in the cold, saying in essence that globalization was here to stay, that their jobs were no longer valuable, and to get the education and training to do something else. If the president hasn't realized the dream of a U.S. manufacturing revival, he has put their concerns on the map. A shift on China. One of the administration's key achievements, for example, is how it has fundamentally changed America's views on China. While his predecessors viewed it as a country that, with some prodding, would gradually open its economy to Western goods and services, Mr. Trump has recast the vision as a U.S. rival whose ways are incompatible with Western economic practices. To counter it, he has employed punishing tariffs, turning conservative free trade policies on their head. The president has been a game changer there, says Douglas Irwin, a trade economist at Dartmouth College. It will be difficult for any future administration to pull back those tariffs without a major agreement on China. In fact, China poses an unprecedented geopolitical challenge to the U.S., both an economic and national security rival, which presidents will have to grapple with for decades to come, says Ewan Morgan, professor of U.S. Studies at University College in London. But a new trade stance towards China and other manufacturing nations remain a work in progress. Mr. Trump struggles to reach even a first phase agreement with China while threatening more tariffs against close allies, making it more difficult for him to create a coalition of nations to counter Beijing. The president's tax cuts represent another signature achievement, yet far from a clear win for average workers. Besides cutting individual tax rates, which primarily benefited the wealthy, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act also lowered corporate tax rates to globally competitive levels, something previous Republican and Democratic administrations has tried but failed to do. The tax cuts link Mr. Trump with the supply-side philosophy of President Reagan, yet have added to a U.S. national debt that is now being further expanded by the coronavirus pandemic. Millions of workers struggling. And although unemployment for Black Americans fell to historic lows just prior to the pandemic, on other fronts, the president has failed to address economic concerns of an increasingly diverse America. His 2017 tax law created opportunity zones to encourage community development. Yet the zones aren't creating the many jobs they were intended to, said Jorge Gonzalez, a research analyst with the Urban Institute. The pandemic downturn has certainly reversed the gains of racial minorities since 2016, yet Mr. Trump in July repeated, "I've done more for Black Americans than anybody with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln." It is not only inaccurate, it's cringeworthy, says Derek Hamilton, a professor of economics and urban policy at the New School in New York. It's hard to take President Trump seriously, but it's also dangerous not to take him seriously. In Mr. Hamilton's view, African Americans have fared worse under President Trump because his tax cuts have starved federal revenues that could be used for job creation and direct help to households. Opportunity zones may lead to gentrification and more inequality, and the wealth gap has continued to widen. Now the pandemic has widened gaps in the U.S. economy still further along lines of race, gender, and whether livelihoods are based on in-person services like restaurants or theme parks. Even in coal country, early job gains under the current administration have evaporated. Just because President Trump may fit a historical pattern doesn't mean he's bound by it, Mr. Skowronek said. He could break the disjunctive mold by being reelected. Perhaps more significant, win or lose, history suggests that part of his economic vision will remain relevant. Moving on to our next article. Trust Your Drill Sergeant. Army Takes New Approach to Basic Training by Anna Mulrain Grobe. James Dahlman remembers his days at Army Infantry Boot Camp nearly 25 years ago with impressive clarity. There was the night privates in their bunks were doing impressions of their drill sergeants, and he overheard them. He marched the new recruits outside and smoked us for 3.5 hours. He was yelling something like, "Humor leads to communism. Communism leads to evil." We were like, what's he talking about? Was he joking? I still don't know. There was the time, too, the drill sergeant convinced recruits they were due an evening of relaxation with a big spaghetti dinner and movies. We ate, and then he took us outside and PT'd us. Physical training in military parlance, until everyone threw up. He got into a little trouble for that, Mr. Dahlman recalls, reflecting. It was a little bit abusive. Mr. Dahlman's experience inspired him to post online tips for new recruits, alerting them to the fabled shark attack, in which sometimes half a dozen drill sergeants will gang up on you and be absolutely relentless. Some people will cry. Do not make eye contact, he implores. Get used to staring off 1,000 miles into the distance. This is your safe spot. Today, the shark attack is no more. The Army's storied infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, announced in September that it was ending the attacks, a move military officials say has been in the works for some time, but was hastened along by the inadvisability of yelling in people's faces during a pandemic. This recognition is one of several shifts in strategic thinking about how to more effectively prepare soldiers for combat that the Army has put on display in recent months, including promotions, naps to restore wakefulness, in a newly updated fitness training manual that also encourages journaling and reflecting on the interconnectedness of all things and people. Derided by some critics as evidence that the military has gone soft, defense officials say these moves mark a recognition that wars have changed, and so have the troops fighting them. The military's new measures will actually build stronger soldiers, they add, and better prepare them for the intellectual and moral challenges they now face. People with Smokey the Bear hats yelling at you, none of the things in the shark attacks are setting an example of anything you'd ever want to instill in terms of leadership. It's the opposite of what you're trying to instill, says retired General David Barno, former commander of U.S. forces in Afghanistan and co-author with Nora Bensel of Adaptation Under Fire, How Militaries Change in Wartime. In a video announcing the change, Command Sergeant Major Robert Fortenberry explained the cornerstones of the event were to establish dominance and authority using intimidation and fear. Drill sergeants were charged with assessing the trainees' ability to handle stress, singling out perceived undesirables by enveloping them in a manner that emulated a shark attack, he said. This activity, however, does not instill the spirit of the infantry. It betrays the innate trust between teammates, and worse, betrays the crucial bond of trust with our leaders. Training for today's wars? Historically, it was generally agreed that all a soldier had to do was march straight and shoot a rifle, said Richard Lacument, research professor and former dean of the Strategic Studies Institute at the U.S. Army War College. Today's troop routinely uses computers, radios, and drones at remote outposts that require them to be more technologically adept and make quick decisions. In an evolution of our expectations for enlisted personnel, how much we rely on them today to be intellectually capable and morally fit. The morally fit piece has come into sharp relief after nearly 20 years of fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, where troops in combat have been more spread out, placing a lot more resilience on the individual to act in a way that's consistent with our values. Mr. Lacument says, the question becomes, can I trust them to do the right thing? And it's harder to trust them if they don't trust you. The new basic training model aims to build that confidence with training exercises that will emphasize belief in oneself, belief in your teammates, and belief in the leaders with whom they serve, Commander Sergeant Major Fortenberry said. Instead of barking at new recruits scrambling off buses, for example, drill sergeants will formally introduce themselves and quiz soldiers on facts they're expected to memorize about the infantry. It's part of an effort, he explained, to help new soldiers realize this journey in the infantry is one that will never take alone, and it is defined by leaders' willingness to share in the hardship. This has long been the approach to the education of officers, if not enlisted service members. When he was a plebe at West Point in 1980, Mr. Laquement and his fellow students were expected to memorize word for word Major General John Schofield's 1879 address to the military academy. The discipline which makes the soldier of a free country reliable in battle is not to be gained by harsh or tyrannical treatment. On the contrary, such treatment is far more likely to be destroyed than to make an army, he warned the Corps of Cadets. It is possible to impart instruction and to give commands in such a manner and such a tone of voice to inspire the soldier no feeling but an intense desire to obey. That made perfect sense to me as a cadet, Mr. Laquement said. They were tough on us. They critiqued us, but no one ever laid a hand on me. The stress came from trying to perform up to their expectations. It is perhaps past time that the officer model of training is carried over into the enlisted ranks as well, he adds. A new kind of drill sergeant. The new basic training model builds on a belief that has become increasingly pronounced in the post-Vietnam era, when the thinking was that while draftees had to be coerced, volunteers needed to be persuaded. The stereotypical full metal jacket drill sergeants were working with conscripts who were unwilling to be in the military from the beginning, notes General Barno. In the modern Army, recruits have gone through a lot of wickets just to show up on the first day of basic training, he says. The Army has worked hard to get these folks in there. You want them to succeed. For Sergeant First Class Cynthia Velarde, picking up the new recruits on their first day of basic training was her favorite part of the job. You're the first NCO, or non-commissioned officer, that those soldiers will see. You have the potential to leave a lasting impression on them for the rest of their careers, she said. By the last day, maybe the kid who could barely pick up a bag or barely do a push-up or never fired a weapon is confident to do that. The ones who wanted to come in the Army and be pushed, physically pushed, are out there rucking for 10 miles. She recalls eating in the mess hall when one former trainee approached her just to say that she has been his senior drill sergeant years earlier. He was standing at parade rest. You run into these kids and they give you the customs and courtesies that we teach them over and over for weeks, the way you carry yourself. They don't forget it. That said, the new changes don't preclude the occasional lambasting, particularly when lives are on the line. Does leadership mean we have to yell at people? No, Sergeant Velarde says, pausing. I mean, sometimes you do have to yell at them. You do. I don't think it's demeaning if you yell at an individual when you've told them 5 times that maybe you need to point your muzzle in a safe direction. There's going to be yelling after that. Up next, can campus unity get small colleges past pandemic into the future? By Kelly Field. When students at Colby College arrived on Mayflower Hill for coronavirus testing in mid-August, they got something in addition to a nasal swab, a blue bracelet with the words, "One Colby," on one side and "Hold the Hill" on the other. The bracelets, the brainchild of student leaders at the small Waterville, Maine college, are a visual reminder of what college presidents everywhere are telling students this semester. Staying open depends on every person acting responsibly. Whenever you look down at your bracelet, you remember that you need to do your part to preserve this opportunity for the whole community, says Sam Rosenstein, the vice president of the Student Government Association. Small colleges have always attracted students seeking small classes and close connections with professors and peers. The sense of community the colleges promise. Now, as colleges of all sizes preach accountability to the campus community, the leaders of some small schools are finding their students particularly receptive to that message. There's a feeling of, we're all in this together, says Sue Stubner, president of Colby Sawyer College in New Hampshire, which has roughly 850 undergrads, but only 2 cases so far. People are looking out for one another. So far, lower caseloads. 7 weeks into the fall semester, Colby College, with roughly 2,000 students on campus, has had only 11 positive cases, 7 students and 4 faculty members and staffers. The fact that it is a small school in a small town in a state with a low COVID-19 risk level has certainly contributed to its success. So has the college's multi-million-dollar investment in twice-weekly testing, a regimen many poorer colleges can't afford. But small schools with less frequent testing in states with higher COVID-19 caseloads aren't seeing many cases either. There are exceptions, of course. Providence College, an urban institution on the upper end of small, roughly 4,400 undergrads, remains under a stay-at-home order amid an outbreak that has caused at least 236 positive cases at the Rhode Island school. Still, most of the stories of students behaving badly have come from large institutions where off-campus parties have become super spreader events. If smaller colleges can keep their infection rate low, it could make the institutions more attractive to future students, boosting enrollment at a time when the number of high school graduates is falling and a growing number of institutions face the threat of closure, particularly in the Northeast. In this time of fear and uncertainty, families may gravitate to the safety and familiarity of small schools, college leaders say. I honestly think this could be a game changer, says Barbara Mistick, president of the National Association of Independent Colleges and Universities. But Robert Kelchen, an associate professor at Seton Hall University who has studied college closures, isn't convinced. He predicts that the recession and associated job losses will only make families more price sensitive and less likely to choose costlier private colleges. The only way they're going to see an increase in enrollment is by giving out more financial aid, and at that point, they're not getting more in the way of tuition, Professor Calchin says. I have a hard time seeing anything other than this accelerating the demise of the most at-risk colleges. Years-long struggle? The private college sector has struggled for years, particularly in the Northeast. Between 2016 and 2019, nearly 40 colleges closed or merged, 17 of them in New England and New York, according to a tally by Inside Higher Ed. For every Colby with a sizable endowment, there's a Colby Sawyer that is barely scraping by. That school's current enrollment of around 850 is roughly half of what it was in the early 2000s. Even before the pandemic hit, 30% of private colleges tracked by the rating agency Moody's were running in a deficit. The pandemic, which has forced colleges to spend millions of online education and campus safety upgrades, has put many of those colleges into an even deeper hole. Between March and May, the number of institutions at risk of closing within 6 years climbed by 110, according to EdMIT, a Boston-based college advisory company. In New England, the number of at-risk colleges doubled in that time period, an analysis by the Boston Globe found. To survive, struggling small colleges will have to come up with new ways to compete for a shrinking number of prospective students. By 2030, the number of high school graduates in New England is expected to decline by 25,000 from its peak in 2007, according to the consulting firm EY Parthenon. For now, though, small colleges are focused on a more immediate threat, the coronavirus. Advantages: size, culture. In responding to the pandemic, many small colleges are using their size and culture to their advantage. Some are sequestering their students, closing their campuses to outside visitors. Others are offering students safe ways to socialize, partitioning their quads into grids so students can attend outdoor concerts and open mic nights spaced 6 feet apart. To get students to buy into their coronavirus response plan, colleges are including them on decision-making panels and asking them to create videos educating their peers about the rules. We're not dictating down to the students, said Kristen McAndrew, Vice President for Enrollment and Marketing at St. Michael's College in Colchester, Vermont. They are responding well because they are part of the conversation. Some colleges with religious affiliations are making appeals to institutional and civic values, reminding students of their responsibility to care for themselves and for one another. It's time for us to walk the talk of our Franciscan Catholic mission. Dennis DePero, president of St. Bonaventure University in southwestern New York, says. He tells his students, at Colby Sawyer College, years of declining enrollment have had one upside: plenty of space to isolate students in single dorm rooms during the pandemic. Dr. Stubner, the president, hopes her college's low caseload will translate into increased enrollment, helping the college recover to around 1,000 students. Safety has always been one of the things parents appreciate about us, she said, but in the pandemic, safety has taken on a whole new meaning. Still, she's not counting on it. This year, the college launched 5 new health science majors aimed at meeting local demand and setting the school apart. The importance of distinguishing ourselves is critical, she says. You have to be able to articulate your value. Nick Dukoff, co-founder of Edmit, the company that forecasts college closures, agrees. He argues that colleges that will survive the pandemic and the coming demographic storm are those that can show a clear return on investment. Colleges that invest in career outcomes are the ones that will do well, he says. If they happen to be small schools, great. But for those schools to do well, community isn't going to be enough. Well, my dear friends and listeners, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October the 9th. This is Pam saying please stay safe until you hear from me again. Be blessed and do what you can do to make today an absolutely great day.